Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham Yahushai, Bahasham Racha Kodash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter. He that is wounded in the stones, that is, your testicles are wounded, okay, or hath his privy member cut off, that's your rod has been cut off, shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Now, the first 8 verses, right, I'd say here are ones that, is needful to explain, or else they can be, a bit confusing, right? So first, dealing with the congregation of the Lord. The congregation of the Lord here is not just being amongst Israel, right? Because then that would be like the Lord saying anybody who is, a eunuch, let's say by physicality, or has their stones wounded, whether it's an accident or whatnot, they're just kicked. They can't be amongst the land. They can't be amongst the people, which is not the case here. Okay, when it mentions shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, this is more so dealing with this individual cannot hold certain positions, right, of authority or high positions within the assembly or the congregation of Israel. Okay, but to actually just like live or dwell amongst Israel, yeah, they can do that. But in matters of like, governing or like officially representing Israel or legal authority or judicial or governing roles, right? Like the elders at the gate or like a judge or a head in Israel, they can't assume that role. They wouldn't be eligible for that. Okay, so when it mentions entering into the congregation, that's in reference to that, and that applies to all those in the verses below. Okay, so verse 2, it says, a bastard shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Now, when you go into this word bastard, it goes into a couple of cases in which one would be classified or deemed as a bastard. Okay, which in the Hebrew is mamzar or mamzar. And it says here, bastard, a child of incest, okay, an illegitimate child, a bastard, mixed population. Now, in the third point here, they do, there's an error, right? They err over here because it says born of a Jewish father and a heathen mother, or vice versa. You are not considered a bastard in Israel if you're not considered a bastard in Israel if you are born of a Jewish father. Okay, if your father is an Israelite, then you are an Israelite by default because the lineage or the genealogy is reckoned after the father. Okay, if your mother, okay, is an Israelite, but your father is a heathen, then you would be considered here the bastard. So the vice versa here is the role that matters. But if your father is an Israelite and your mother is a heathen, that doesn't make you a bastard. Okay, so it's saying that any one of these, which your father is a heathen and your mom is an Israelite, then you're a bastard, right? Or you were born of incest. In that case, you wouldn't be allowed, as it says, going back to the verse, to enter into the congregation of the Lord, right? Now, when you look at dealing with the congregation of the Lord, like we mentioned above, when you go to the time like in the wilderness, there was a case, right, of a heathen, right? His father was an Egyptian, but his mother was an Israelite. And it says he strove with another Israelite in the camp. And then he ended up, cursing the name of the Lord, and then he got put to death. He was among the congregation, right? So if entering into the congregation meant literally being among or around Israel, then that wouldn't make sense, okay? Because there are other cases like that where, for example, you had well, actually in the verse below, it's actually going to go into that. So when we get there, we'll deal with it. But basically, once again, it's dealing with the same quote unquote entering as we read in verse 1, right? Basically having a say or being in some position of authority or judicial role amongst the assembly of Israel, right? Amongst Israel. So if there's like a gathering, there's an assembly, there's a holy day, there's some some gathering of Israel, you're not gonna have a position, all right, of basically being able to dictate or get a say in an authoritative decision over there. Okay, so a bastard, as it says here, or one that is illegitimate, like we just read here, would not be allowed to assume that role. Just like one whose stones are wounded, or his private member or privy member is cut off. It says, even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord. This 10th is more so like forever, right? Completely for all his generations, because when you go into, it's like when the Lord mentions he shows his love and his mercy to 1,000 generations, right? Of them that love him. That doesn't mean, it says 1,000, which is a number, but it doesn't mean that in the 1,001st generation he's going to stop loving them or showing mercy to them. So it's a similar concept here. Okay, and we know that as well, because if one of the definitions of a bastard is one that is born of a heathen father and an Israelite mother, they're never, okay, gonna be allowed to enter into the congregation of the Lord by the definition we just defined here, right? The Lord is never gonna say, let me let one that is born of a heathen or a heathen father come and assume some role of authority or judicial, representation in my nation of people. That's never going to happen. Not after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 or 10 generations. Verse 3, it says, an Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. So why would if 10 generation here means your actual 10 generations, then why did the Lord add forever at the end? Okay. Number 2, when you deal with like Ruth, for example, Ruth was a Moabite, but she came amongst Israel, right? She dwelt amongst Israel. That was the foremother of David. So that goes to show you that entering the congregation here is not simply just dwelling amongst Israel and so on. It's more than that. Okay, and we know here no heathen, whether Ammonite or Moabite or any other nation, would be able to assume that role in our congregation, okay, forever. Verse 4, because they met you not with bread and with water in the way when ye came forth out of Egypt. Right. Because, and what that means is they basically didn't show us hospitality. Right. Yeah, they sold bread and water to us and we bought it from them. But what did Moab and Ammon do? All right, in particular Moab. It's going to go into it right here. It says, and because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee. So they weren't coming out to meet us and be cheerful, and no, they weren't trying to have peace with us. Nevertheless, the Lord thy God would not hearken unto Balaam. So Balaam went to try and curse us, but the Lord's like, nah, you better you better go and say the right words, and it better be blessings. But the Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee. Okay. Verse 6, thou shalt not seek their peace nor their prosperity all thy days forever. So think about that, right? If 10 generations here is literal, why would the Lord say, don't seek their peace in all thy days forever, but after 10 generations, allow them into the congregation of Israel? That doesn't make sense. Verse 7, thou shalt not abhor an Edomite. Okay, now when you go into that word, let's go into a couple of these, right? The word abhor is to basically have in contempt, hold, like look at as completely abominable. You want to have absolutely zero dealings and doings with them. Damn, this thing is annoying. Stop this and try it again. Okay, let's deal with the word abhor. All right, tha'ib It says to abhor, to be abominable, to do abominably, to be detested, right? To loathe, to make abominable, okay? To detest. So we want absolutely nothing to do with them. And so when it says here, thou shalt not abhor an Edomite, number one, the word Edomite here is incorrectly used. Okay, this word should not be Edomite, but uh, Syrian. Okay, so it says here in the Hebrew up top, right? Adamya. Okay, and you can see in the KJV translation counts this Hebrew word Adamya in the King James version, or in the blue letter here, was translated 11 times as Edomites and one time as Syria. Okay, and let me see if they have anything in here. Okay, so when we actually go into it says patronym from Adam. Let's click on that. Yeah, that goes back to Edom. And I'm looking. Okay, let me actually go back to the one time it's translated as Syria. So when we click on that, that is in the verse 2 Kings 16 and 6. And you can see here where it says the Syrians, that's H130. That same H130, as you can see at the top, Strong's H130 matches the Hebrew Adamya, right? But that's incorrect because they're using that same H130 in Deuteronomy to refer to Edomites. But here in 2 Kings, they translate it as Syrians. Okay? The word that should be there in Deuteronomy is not Adamya, but Aram, okay, which is Syrians, Aramya, Syrians. Let's click on here. Okay, no, ain't much on here. Yeah, so if you click on that word Syrians, if you went into 2 Kings in that, like we just did, and looked into that word Syrians, you'd see that it would show you here Edomite, which is incorrect. So this is an actual error here, all right, that the blue letter has. And the correct understanding of verse 7 here is that when it says thou shalt not abhor an Edomite, it really should be thou shalt not abhor a Syrian. Okay, the Hebrew word there should be Aram, not a dumb. So thou shalt not abhor a Syrian, for he is thy brother. Now, when it says for he is thy brother, the Syrian here, Aram, is not really referring to the son, the descendants of the son of Shem, Aram. Okay, this is actually referring to Abraham's relatives, because when Abraham left Ur, his relatives, as he was making his way to Canaan, stayed in Syria. That's where he went to get a wife for Isaac, his son, and that's where Jacob went to get his wives. They were of the same stock as Abraham. Okay, Laban and all of them. So they are the ones that is being referred to here, that you're not supposed to abhor them, for he is thy brother, meaning they are our relatives. Okay, and even I think in a later chapter in Deuteronomy, the Moses mentions, speaking about Abraham, that he was a Syrian ready to perish. Okay, so that's referring to him being a Syrian by dwelling in that land, or coming from that land. Okay, from temporarily dwelling over there, but not that he is an actual Aramean. So just to explain that first sentence over there in Deuteronomy 23 and 7. Now it says, thou shalt not abhor an Egyptian, because thou was a stranger in his land. Now, once again, going into that abhor, which is like to hold in complete contempt and abomination, the Lord is saying here is, what the Lord is saying is, don't look at them, as 100% completely just abominable, because remember that you were still a stranger in their land, right? At some point, they still gave you a place to dwell in their land. So remember that when you think about them, right? It's kind of like somebody you really, really dislike, or somebody you just, you're not cool with, but they did something good for you at one point in life. So it's like you may talk bad about them, but you always remember, right, that, hey, this person is a piece of ish, but I remember that at one point when I was, in this situation, they did help me out. That doesn't mean that the Lord is saying we got to go and love the Egyptians or we have to go and show favor to them, but just keeping in mind, um, not to wholly 100% abhor them because of the fact that we were a stranger in their land. And I say that because guess what? At the end of the day, they're also going to be a part of the nations that we're going to have under us, right, in captivity. And the scriptures talk about us breaking the heathens like a potter's vessel. That's going to include the Egyptians as well. Okay, so this doesn't, this verse doesn't negate any form of judgment or superiority that we're going to have over them either. Verse 8, it says, "The children that are begotten of them shall enter into the congregation of the Lord in their third generation." So now this may sound like a contradiction because wait, we read above that, they're not going to come into the congregation at all. But now it's saying here that, they'll enter into the congregation. Now, the children that are begotten of them here are referring to begotten of their women, meaning an Israelite man that has children by a Syrian here or an Egyptian or one of those nations will be able to enter into the congregation in the third generation. Because if this was the other way around, saying, for example, Egyptians and heathens can enter into the congregation, they would be considered a bastard too. Because you could have an Egyptian man and an Israelite woman, that would be considered as a bastard. And we read up above a couple of verses that a bastard shall not enter into the congregation. So here in verse 8, this is talking about their women, right? That if an Israelite man has a child with a woman of one of these nations that we just read above, that in the third generation, they would be allowed to enter into the congregation of the Lord. So they could be allowed to, to be made a judge in Israel or hold one of those official, or legally authorizing governing roles or positions within our assembly or our congregation. Because then they get a say, right, in matters that are decided. Verse 9, when the host goeth forth against thine enemies, then keep thee from every wicked thing, right? So when we go out to war against our enemies, any wicked thing, you got to make sure you're staying away from. If there be among you any man that is not clean by reason of uncleanness, that chanceth him by night, this is talking about nocturnal emission. That is, in other words, a wet dream. Okay, so if a man becomes unclean by night, meaning he has a wet dream and his seed of copulation leaves his body, then he is unclean. He shall not go abroad, or he shall go abroad out of the camp because he's unclean. He shall not come within the camp. But it shall be when evening cometh, or cometh on, he shall wash himself with water. And when the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. Okay, because then he would be clean at sundown. Verse 12, thou shalt have a place also without the camp, whither thou shalt go forth abroad. So whenever it says somebody has to be put out the camp, there was a place where they would stay. Okay, they wouldn't just be, under a tree somewhere. Verse 13, and thou shalt have a paddle upon thy weapon, and meaning a paddle as part of your tools. When you go into this word paddle, they describe it as like like a giant, like a peg, or like them tools that you use to keep the tent, in place. But you're gonna have that. So as it says, and it shall be when thou wilt ease thyself abroad, when you need to excrete waste, right? You need to, you know, ease yourself, for lack of a better word. Thou shalt dig therewith. You don't dig up the ground, and shall turn back and cover that which cometh from thee. It's kind of like what animals do, right? You're going to dig a hole in the ground, you're going to drop your waste in there, and then you cover it up. For the Lord thy God walketh in the midst of thy camp to deliver thee and to give up thine enemies before thee. Right? So the Lord is among you in the midst of the camp to protect you, right, and also go with you to deliver your enemies to you. Therefore thy camp shall be holy, that he see no unclean thing in thee, and turn away from thee. Right? So you ain't just gonna go on some random area and just leave a dump, just out in the open like that, because that's gonna be a unclean thing. It's gonna be unholy. The Lord is gonna see that. He's not, hell no, I'm out of here. The fuck is that shit? Oh hell no. I'm not doing this. So you want to avoid that. Verse 15. Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. So if a servant, a slave escapes, or a servant escapes, you're not supposed to return them back to their master. And if you think about it, like, unless the servant was just really, really adamant on it, or the master was just a terrible person, terrible master, you know, the servant, doing his best to escape like that is a telling sign, right? But you're not supposed to return them. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. So if he flees to your city, you can't return him back to his owner. You let him dwell there. There shall no whore of the daughters of the daughters of Israel. There shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. Now, when you actually look into these words here, okay, it's interesting. The whore, one of the definitions, in addition to just, you're just being a harlot, one of the definitions here is actually a temple prostitute. Okay, so let's look into the word whore here. Quadasha. It says a female temple prostitute, a harlot. Okay, and these temple prostitute, because the word here is different than the word used for just a regular like harlot. Okay, and when we look here, it says and it's the same. I believe it's the same word for a sodomite as well, but it says a sodomite consecrated to Astarte or Venus and prostituting himself in her honor. Okay, and that's when it talks about not having a harlot, a whore or a prostitute, or a whore or a sodomite. It says here consecrated to Venus, hence a harlot, as to the libidinous worship of Venus amongst the Babylonians. See Lucian, de Dia, Syria. Yeah, and then it goes into that. So when you go into that word whore, there is dealing with a female temple prostitute, which would basically have sex in a ritualistic sense in honoring their god or their deities. So no daughters are supposed to make themselves like that, right? Nor a sodomite, same word there, or the same root word, kordash here. Interesting. But it says here a male temple prostitute, right? When you go into that word sodomite. So you have a sodomite, which is like, you have sodomy, let me say that, which is like one that, sodomizes, enters into the rear of another, which is off. But here for the word, you have a male temple prostitute, which is the male version of um the female temple prostitute. Okay. But you weren't supposed to do that either. It says here sacred person, i.e., technically male devotee, by prostitution to licentious idolatry. Okay. Sodomite, unclean. And this was a practice of the Canaanites in the land, right? The heathens in the land, which is why the Lord said by Moses that we're not supposed to do that. Okay. So let's go back up a bit. Verse 18, thou shalt not bring the hire of a whore or the price of a dog. See, now when you go into the word whore over here, you have a different word, right? What's that? Zana, which now it goes into to commit fornication, to be a harlot, play the harlot, to be a harlot, act as a harlot, commit fornication, to be unfaithful, to be a cult prostitute, right? Because that's a subcategory of this word, because a cult prostitute is still a whore, right? But in a specified focused section of doing it in an idolatrous form onto their God. So here, what it's saying is you're not supposed to give, the hire, the money, okay, from a whoredom or the price of a dog. A dog here is not an animal. It's referring to a male prostitute. Okay. So it says here the hire. Shoot. Bear with me. Let's bring this back up here. The price of a dog. Yeah, dog here. Kalab. So you have, dog in the literal sense, but you also have of pagan sacrifice or of male cult prostitute. Okay, a male prostitute. It says here to yelp or ease to attack a dog, hence by euphemism, a male prostitute. A euphemism is like another way of saying, so, instead of just saying male prostitute directly, they call him a dog. So of any money associated with them that's not supposed to be brought into the temple or to the house of the Lord, thy God, for any vow, for even both of these are abomination unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Usury is interest. So you're not supposed to charge interest to your brother, right? To your fellow Israelite on money, food, whatever, anything you lend on to them. Verse 20, unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury. So this is a heathen. You can charge interest to a heathen, but to a fellow Israelite you're not supposed to. That the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. So you follow these ways so the Lord can bless you. When thou shalt vow a vow unto the Lord Yahweh thy God, thou shalt not slack to pay it. For the Lord thy God will surely require it of thee, and it would be sin to thee. Right? If you take a vow and you don't, as it says, pay it. Right? You don't fulfill that vow. That would be sin unto you. But if thou shalt forbear to vow, it shall be no sin in thee. So it's better that you don't vow at all than to vow and not keep it. That which is gone out of thy lips, thou shalt keep and perform. So whatever promise you made, whatever vow you took, you have to perform it. Even a free will offering, according as thou hast vowed. So the thing that you freely of your own will vowed to do or to give, you have to do so. It says, thou hast vowed unto the Lord thy God, which thou hast promised with thy mouth. See? When thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat grapes thy fill. So if you come into somebody's vineyard and there's grapes, you can eat it. If you're hungry, you eat until you're full, at thine own pleasure. But thou shalt not put any in thy vessel. So now you start to go off if you start gathering it to try and take some to go with you. Now you can't do that. When thou comest into the standing corn of thy neighbor, so a cornfield, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand. So you can pluck some corn with your hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle onto thy neighbor's standing corn. So don't go up into somebody's field and start harvesting their corn. You one or two here and there, that's fine. That's why the remains are there. But you getting greedy out here trying to harvest your joint, you're going off. And that brings us to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Racha Kodash. And until next time, Shalom.